because this input field is no longer that old one. Okay, so this is how we are going to be making it unique. Now let's talk about the use effect hook. So use effect hook allow you to perform a side effects in your component. So some example of what side effects are like fetching the data, directly updating the DOM, and also logging something to the console are also considered to be a side effect inside your component. So anytime you want to do some sort of a side effect inside your component, like for instance, if you want to fetch some sort of a data inside your component, so in that situation, we are going to be using the use effect hook. So how the syntax will look like? Here you can see we are now first of all using our use effect hook, and now inside this use effect hook we are now providing our callback function to it, and then inside that callback function you can do anything you want to do. But there are a few things that I want you to keep in mind when working with the use effect. The first thing is, here you can see we are not providing any array. That array is something called the dependency array, which I'm going to be explaining in a few seconds. So anytime we don't specify the dependency array, so in that situation that callback function will call on every single render. I want you to keep that in mind. Whenever we don't specify the dependency array, which means like that callback function which we are now providing inside our use effect will be fired on every single render. Next, let's talk about the use effect with conditional. So you cannot wrap your hook inside the conditional statement. If you want to use the conditional statement, you're going to have to use the inside the use effect hook. Okay, so also keep that in mind. Now the final thing that I want you to keep in mind is that anytime we specify the empty dependency array for our use effect, it will only fire that function which is available inside our use effect hook on the initial render. Like when our component first renders, it will call that function, not when our component changes. But if we create some sort of a state and we provided the value of that state, so anytime that state changes, that component will re-render and that callback function will fire. Okay, so I know that was a lot of theories. Now let's get into the coding and then you'll get to know what I'm talking about. Now let's talk about yet another hook which is called the use effect hook. So we set up the use effect hook to run some code when our component renders for the first time and whenever it re-renders, and also when some sort of a data changes inside our component. So how are we going to be making a setup for that? The first thing that we have to do is that we have to grab our use state and also the use effect. Okay, so we are going to be importing our use effect from the React.js, and now we have to use that. But before we use that, I'm going to also make a setup for my value. So I'll just use like value and also set value, and that's going to be equals to the use state, and we're going to be providing the initial value of 0 inside there. Now I'm going to be using my use effect hook, and now inside this use effect hook it takes two arguments. The first argument it takes is a callback function, and the second argument it takes is a dependency array, which is something I'm going to be showing you in a few seconds. But now let's talk about this callback function. Now inside this callback function you can write any kind of logic that you like. You can even use your document.title, you can log something to the console, you can fetch some sort of a data, you can do anything you want to do inside this callback function. Okay, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just use my console.log, and I'm going to just write like call use effect right here, and I'm going to also use my document.title, and that's going to be equals to increment, and I'll just provide the value which I've already set up inside my state right here. Okay, so I'll just call there. Now the next thing that I want to do is that I'm going to just remove this f from here, and now inside there I'll just use my h2, and I'm going to also render my value inside there, and also I'm going to just create a button to increment my counter. So I'll just use like click me, and I'm going to also provide the on click event handler to it, and let's just pass our callback function inside there. So I'll just use like set value, and here we are going to be passing like value plus 1, which is just incrementing there. So here you can see I want you to only focus on this use effect right here. Now inside this use effect we are not providing our dependency array. We are just creating our use effect, or we are just calling our use effect, and we are just passing our callback function to there. Okay, so now if I save the changes and if I refresh there, here you can see we are now getting this result which is like called use effect twice. And why are we getting there twice? That's because here you can see we are using this strict mode. So if I just remove this strict mode from here, save my file, and now if I refresh there, I'm only getting this message once, not twice. So that's also something, if you want to keep in mind, you can totally keep that in mind. So yeah, so here you can see now anytime I change something inside my component, that callback function will fire every single time. Okay, so here you can see if I click on this button, and it's going to give us that message once again. If If I click on there once again, and here you can see my title is changing, and also I am getting this result right here inside my console. So why is that? That's because we are not providing any dependency array right here. So when we are not providing any dependency array to our use effect, it will run this code every single time whenever our component re-renders. So I want you to keep that in mind. But now I'm gonna also provide my empty dependency array right here. So if I just use like comma, and I'm gonna also provide my empty dependency array, and now if I save my file, and now let me just refresh there, here you can see we are getting what called use effect on the first render. But now if I click on this button, we are not getting our result right here. And here you can see the title, it is also not incrementing, and we are also not getting any more results. Why is that? As I said, that once we specify this empty dependency array, we didn't specify nothing inside there, like this dependency array is totally empty. So in that situation, this callback function will only fire once. Once our component renders, this callback function will fire, but not again and again. But now in this situation, I'm gonna also copy this value, and I'm gonna also place that right here. So if I save my file, and now let me just refresh there, and here you can see we have our callback function called once again. And now if I click on this click me button, we are getting there. Now I know a lot of people will ask me like, Hussein, what's the point of providing this value? And we can also just remove the, and it's gonna also give us that same result right here, like we are getting this result right here inside the console. And also our title is also incrementing. So like if I click on there, here you can see both of them are working exactly the same thing, like, don't they? Now now if we specify this value right here, and anytime our component changes because of this state, this callback function will fire. But if we have some sort of a other state, and that state is also re-rendering our component, this code will not fire. So now let me just give you the example of that. I feel like I'm confusing you. So you know what, let me just say that once again. Now that we specify the value of this state, and anytime that state changes and our component re-renders because of this state, this callback function will fire. But if we have some sort of a other state and our component rendered or re-render because of that other state, this callback function will not fire. So now let me give you an example of that. So I'll just use like const and then something and then set something, and that's going to be equals to this use effect one more time, and we're going to be providing the initial value of 0 to there. So I'm going to duplicate this line of code, and I'm going to also write like increment by something. Okay, and now instead of providing the set value, I'm going to change that to like set something. And now if I save my file, and here you can see if I just refresh there, and I want you to keep in mind, here you can see it's going to give us that value for the first render. And now if I click on the click me, it will re-render my component because of this state right here. We are now providing this value right here. But now if I click on this increment by something, nothing is happening right here. And why is that? Because here you can see we are only providing this value, which is a state value, and whenever our component changes because of this value, so then this callback function will fire. Okay, and whenever our component changes because of something else, this callback function will not fire. So if I also copy there, and if I just write a comma here, and I'm going to also provide this something right here, save my file, and now let me just refresh there. If I click on this button, it's going to fire. If I click on this button, it's going to also fire. Okay, so yeah, keep that in mind. And now the final thing that I want to show you is that the conditional statement. So I'm going to just remove that from here. And now if I just use like if value is greater than 0, I want to wrap this entire hook inside that conditional statement. So if I save my file and watch what happens, so here you can see we are getting our UI, but now if I click on the click me button, we are getting our error right here, and that's a huge error. You know, I'm gonna go to the top. React has detected a change in the order of the hook called by app. This will lead to a bug and errors if not fixed. For more information, go to this link. Okay, so we are not allowed to wrap our hook inside the conditional rendering. If you want to use some sort of a condition, we have to use that inside the use effect. So if I just put that inside this use effect, I'm gonna also put that inside this use effect. And now if I save my file, and now if I just refresh there, and now I can click on there, and everything will work totally the same. So yeah, that was just the basics of use effect. I'm gonna remove all of that stuff, and now let me show you how we are going to be fetching a data by using our use effect. So I'll just save my file. Now let's get into the data fetching. So to fetch our data, the first thing that we have to do is that we have to create some sort of a state where we're going to be putting our data. So I'll just use like data and then set data, and we're going to be using our use stat once again. In the initial value, I'm going to specify empty array right here. Okay, now underneath there, I'm going to be using my use effect one more time, and now inside this use effect, I'm going to just pass my callback function. And now here, I'm going to pass my empty dependency array right here. This empty dependency array just simply means that this callback function will run only once. Okay, and now inside there, we are going to be using our asynchronous function. So I'll just create my asynchronous function, and I'm going to give it the name of like get data. You can give it any name that you like. I'm not going to be providing any perimeter to that, and I will just use like aware, and we are going to be fetching our data from this resource. If I go to this JSON placeholder.typey code, and here you can see this is a website of there. You can learn more about that if you wanted to, but the one we are interested in is by getting this data. So I'll just copy there, or you know what, I'm gonna just go into the to-dos. So I'll just use that right here, and I'm going to provide my to-dos and hit enter, and here you can see it's going to give us a lot of to-dos right here. So we have like ID, you know, let me just zoom in a bit. So we have our ID, we have the title, and also the completed flag for all of these data. And by the way, this is array, so that's why we set up our use as our array right here. I'm going to copy this link, and now I'm going to go into my file right here, and we're going to be placing that inside our fetch. Okay, so I'll just place it right here, and I'm going to also store them in some sort of a variable like const res or response would be fine. And now underneath there, I'll just convert that to the JSON. So it's going to give us like response. I'm going to change that to the JSON and store that in the data variable. Okay, so now I can log the data, and I can do a lot of things with that data, but you know, I'm going to just provide a conditional statement like if we have the data and the data dot length, like if you have some sort of a data, so in that situation we are going to be taking our state, which is a set data, and we're going to be using that right here. And now let me just run them. We're going to be taking that data as a return value, and we're going to be putting that inside our set data. Okay, now that we successfully created our function, but now we have to call that right here inside there. So if I just use like get data, and I'm gonna just execute there, and this is how we are going to be fetching our data by using the use effect. Our data fetching logic is now successfully done, so I'm gonna collapse that right here. Now that we successfully get the data, but the next thing that we have to do is that we have to render that data to the DOM. So I'm going to be using like UL, and inside this UL I'm going to use my data, because this is the state where all of our data is located. So we're going to be using there, and we already know that there is, come on, let me just go into the to do, that is array, and inside this array we have a lot of like objects right here. So we're going to be iterating over through there, and to iterate over through there we are going to be using the map method, and I'm going to just paste like item or to do would be fine. Okay, so now inside each of these to do, we're going to be using our li, and now I'll just render like come on, I'll render like to do dot title, and I guess that's going to be fine. I can also provide the ID of like math dot random, or I can use like to do dot id, which is this ID. Hopefully it will give us, so we have our ID right here, so you can also use that. So if I save my file, and here you can see we are now getting all of the to-dos ID. So now let me just refresh there, and everything is working the way we expect him to work. So we are now getting the ID, but we can also get the body. Okay, we don't have the body. So if I go into, let me just go back. Yeah, I'm gonna go to the post, and now inside this post we have our body. So I'm gonna copy there, I'm gonna go in there, and here I'll just change that to posts, or yeah, posts would be fine. So if I save there, now I can successfully get the body as well. So if I just duplicate there and change that to the body, and we are getting an error, so we have to wrap that in some sort of a section. I'm gonna cut that from here and also place that here, save my file, and now if I go there, refresh there, god damn it, I'm not getting any body. Each charge should be a unique key. God, cut that from here, put there for the section. We don't need that right here, so I'll just remove the. Okay, save my file and refresh there. We're only getting the title, but I guess we're not getting the body. So if I just write like body and dash dash, yeah, we are getting this body right here. So yeah, this is how we are going to be getting the title, and this is how we are going to be getting the body. So this is how we are going to be using the use effect to fetch the data, and also we learn a lot about the use effect. Welcome to the use effect challenge. So in this one, I want you to create the use effect component, then use the use effect to log message to the console whenever the component first mounts. For example, when it runs for the first time. Then in the second portion, you're going to be using the use effect one more time. Create first of all the counter effect component. Then use the use effect to update the document title. Whenever the component value changes, like first you have to initialize the count to 0 value by using the use stat. Then render a button that increments the count and use the use effect to update the document title whenever the component changes. And finally, you're going to be using the use effect to fetch the data. So first of all, you have to create a component with the name of like fetch data effect, and then inside that you're going to be using the use effect to fetch your data from this endpoint, like from this API, which is a JSON placeholder.typeicode.com and /post. So yeah, give it your best shot. If you can do it, then come back and watch the solution, and I'm going to give you my solution. So first of all, create a component with the name of like basic effect.jsx. I'm going to be using my RAFC inside there. Let's just go ahead and go to my app and register my component right in here. So I'll use like basic effect and close this. So if I save my file, and here you can see we're now getting our basic component or basic effect rather. Now the first thing that I want to do is that I want to grab my use effect from the React.js, and I'm going to be passing a callback function to there. And inside there, let's just use our console.log, which will say like basic component mounted right here. We're going to be also providing an empty dependency array, and watch what happens whenever the component first renders. So I'll just write like h1 and check the console to see the message. So we're going to be checking the console right now. So let me just go ahead and go to the console. Let's just refresh them, and now we are getting a basic component mounted for the first time. And why is that? That's because of this empty dependency array. So that was the challenge number 1, and let's just remove them. I'm going to create another component which will be a counter effect.jsx, and let's just use our RAFC inside there and register my component right here, which will say counter effect, and I'm going to place there right here. And inside this component, the first thing that I want to do is that I want to create my count, and also set count is going to be equals to the use stat, and the initial value will be set to 0. Now I'm going to be using the use effect one more time for the side effects. So now inside them, we're going to be also passing a count right here, like whenever our component changes because of this stat. So watch what will happen. So I'll just use like document.title, and that's going to be equals to this template literal, and let's just provide our count and the count value from our stat. So I'll just use like $sign and then this count. And now for this UI, I'm going to remove that from here, and I will just write like count here and render my count totally dynamically. Now we are going to be also creating a button which will say like increment, and here whenever somebody clicks on this button, we're going to be firing this function which will be the set count, and here we have to specify count plus 1. I'm going to save my file right now and watch what happens. So here you can see, I want you to notice this area right here, this title. So whenever I click on this increment, it's going to change the counter to it, and it's going to also change this count title right here to add. So if I just click on there, and here you can see it's going to increment my counter by 1. So that was the second challenge. Now for the third challenge, we have to create our fetch data component. So I'll use like fetch data effect.jsx, and let me just use my RAFC inside there. Let's just create our state so that we can store our data inside there. So I'll just use like post and then set post, and that's going to be equals to the use stat, and we're going to be providing the empty dependency array, or not dependency but empty array, just for holding our data. Now we are going to be performing the side effects. So for that we have to use our use effect, and here we are going to be providing our empty dependency array right here. And now we are going to be defining our function which will allow us to fetch our data. So what am I even doing? What the hell? Let's just provide our asynchronous function, and we are going to be providing first of all the response, and let's just use our await, and we're going to be fetching our data from this URL, and also we have to convert our data or response to JSON. So we're going to be storing them in the data, and finally we have to store them inside our state. So we're going to be using like set post and put our data inside there. Now underneath this function we are going to be calling it. Okay, so now if I save my file and call them, and it's going to give us the perfect response. So we have to also render their data to the DOM so that we can see them. So I'm not going to do anything crazy, so I'll just write like first post title, and here underneath this h1 we're going to be iterating over through all of the posts. So I'll just use like post.length is greater than 0. So in that situation we're going to be using our h2, and I'll just write like post, and we just only want to get the first post. We're not interested in all of them, and we only want to get the title out of there. But if that's not the case, we are going to be rendering or lowering dot dot dot. So now if I save my file, first of all, we won't have to register. So I'll just go to my app and comment this line out and register my fetch data effect component there, save my file. Now we are getting this title and yeah, this body as well. So now if I refresh there, it's going to give us the loading for a brief second, as you can see, and then it's going to give us the data. This is how we are going to be fetching a data by using the use effect, and this is how we are going to be performing more side effect by using the use effect. So now let me just uncomment all of that, and now we can increment something, and we can also check out the logs and stuff like that. So now let's talk about the famous problem with React.js, which is called the prop drilling. So what is a prop drilling and why should anyone care about that? So here you can see I have a component hierarchy right here. So I have a different component like app, card, header, navigation, user, date, time, and so on and so forth. And here inside the app component, I have a data. Suppose if I want to paste that data from the app component to the date component, so how can I go about doing that? So to do that, there are a lot of ways to do that in React.js, which we are going to be learning throughout the course, like by using Zusten and also using the context API and also Redux toolkit. And there are a lot of ways, but now let's talk about the prop drilling. We are going to be drilling this data into multiple components. So we are going to be taking that data and we are going to be passing that data into all of these components by using the props. So how are we going to be doing that? So I'm going to pass my data from the app component to the card component by using the prop. Then I'm going to pass that to the users component, and now finally I'm going to pass that to the date component, and then there we can use that. But imagine if you are working with like Google or maybe Facebook or some big companies, they would have like a lot of components, and I mean like a lot. They would have like 1,000 component, if not million component. So what you will do is that you will just paste your data by using the props and you will just drill your data. Now there is a solution for that. I'm going to show you that solution in a few seconds, but first of all I want to show you the prop drilling in action, then we will jump into the solution. So now let's talk about the prop drilling in action. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just create my components folder, and inside this folder I'm going to create my component a.jsx and also component b.jsx and finally component c.jsx. And now I'll just go into my component A and I'm going to use my RAFCE, and I'm going to go to the component B. Let's just use our RAFCE, and also to the component C. So now inside my app component, I'm going to just create some sort of a variable with the name of like name, and I'm going to give my name inside there. So I'm going to save this file. Now we have to paste this name data into this component C. So how can you go about doing that? So to do that, the first thing that we have to do is that we have to call our component A, and now let's just render them. We have to paste that name as the prop for our component A. So I'll just provide my name right here. I'm going to save that. Now inside my component A, I'm going to destructure that right here, and also we are going to be just passing that into the component B. So I'll just use like component B, and I'm going to hit enter, so it's going to auto import there. Now we're going to be taking that prop of name and we're going to be passing that to our component B. So I'll just write like name right here, so I'm going to save there. Now I'm going to go into the component B. I'm going to also destructure there right here. I'll just use my name, and finally we have to use that inside the component C. Okay, so I'll just close that right here, and I'm going to also pass that as a prop so that I can use that inside my component C. So I'll just go to my component C, and I'm going to just destructure that right here. I'll just destructure my name, and now let's just use that right here. So I'll just use my H1, and now I'm going to just render the name right here. So if I save my file now, so now we are drilling this name as a prop to all of these components. Like first of all, we are passing that to component A, then to the component B, then to the component C, and finally we are now rendering that inside the component C. So that's going to be a lot of process. And let's suppose if you are working with some sort of a bigger company and you're going to have to pass your data as a prop to all of these components, and that's going to be a nightmare. So to solve this problem, we are going to be learning about the context API. So now let's talk about the context API. Context API is a feature that allows you to manage and share state across your component tree without having to pass prop down manually at every level of your component tree. It is useful for scenarios where you need to share data or function across many components, especially when these components are deeply nested, something which we just saw a few seconds ago. So for that we use a props, but in this situation we are not going to be using any props. We are going to be using something called the context API, and now let's get into it. So that was the basic theory about the context API, and now let's refactor our prop drilling to use the context API. So what I'm going to do is that first of all, I'm going to have to import my context. So I'll just use like create context, and we're going to be importing there from the React.js. So now that we successfully import there, so the next thing that we have to do is that we have to create the instance of there. So I'll just use like create context, and now we're going to have to store then some sort of a variable. So I'll just give it the name of like data. You can like basically give it any name that you like, and I'm going to also export there so that I can use this context anywhere inside my project. So that's good. Now the next thing that I want to do is that I want to wrap my entire application to use this context. So how can I go about doing that? I'll just wrap there by using my data, which is now holding the value of my context. So I'm now calling this data right here, and now I'm going to just close there. And once I close there, and I'm going to also wrap my component A inside there, then we have two properties. So if I just write like dot, it's going to give us consumer, and it's going to also give us the provider. So provider just simply means it's going to allow us to provide our value or our data into multiple components. So I'm going to just choose this provider, and here we just have to use our value, and inside this value we have to pass their data which we want to pass inside our component. So we no longer have to use all of these props. So I'm going to just remove that from here. I'm going to copy my name from there, and I'm going to just put that right here. So if I save my file, and we also have to just copy this one, and we have to place it right here. So this is how we are going to be using our prop. First of all, we have to import there, then we have to create an instance of there, then we have to use the provider property on there, and this provider property will allows us to provide our data into multiple components. So we no longer have to drill our data into multiple components by using the props. So I'm going to go into my component A, and we no longer need this name right here. So I'm going to just remove there. Let's just remove there. I'm going to go into the component B. I'm going to also remove that from here. Let's just remove that from here. And now inside the component C, I'm going to also remove that from here. But now the question is, how are we going to be receiving that data now that we pass that data right here into this component? But how in the world we are going to be receiving that or consuming that? To receive that, the first thing that we have to do is that we have to import our context. As I said, like we're going to be using this export so that we can use this context inside multiple components. So now we are going to be importing that. So I'll just use like import my data, and if I just hit enter right here, so it's going to import that from my app component. And now we have to use that inside our component. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just remove that from here, and I'm going to also remove this divs from here, and instead I'm going to replace that with this data. And if I just write the dot, so what are we getting? We are now getting the provider, and we are also getting the consumer. So this consumer will allows us to consume their data or receive their data. This is how we are passing the data, and this is how we are going to be receiving that data. Now this consumer take a callback function, so we are going to be passing our function inside there to get our data. So I'm going to just write these curly braces right here, and I'm going to just provide my function. It's going to take the parameters, so I'm going to just specify the parameter of name, and now let's just create our callback function. Now inside there I can just return like h1, and now inside this h1 I can use my name right here. So if I just write a name, save my file, and if I just refresh there, and here you can see I'm now getting my name. So if I go ahead and change that to like I don't know, John or something, so here you can see we're now getting what John. So that's looking cool, like we are totally receiving this data. But now the question is let's suppose if I want to provide like multiple data, so how can I go about doing that? I'm going to go into my context once again, and I'm going to just duplicate there, like we're creating one more instance of our context, and I'm going to just rename that to a data1. You can like basically give it any name that you prefer, but in my case I'm going to just rename that to data1. I'm going to save this file, and now the next thing that we have to do is that we have to just create some sort of other data so that we can pass that data into our component. So I'll just use like age in this case, and I am 22, so I'll just put my 22 age right here. Okay, and now if you want to pass that into our component, so in that situation we are going to be using our data1 and then dot, and we have our provider, and this provider will allows us to pass our data. So I'm going to just wrap that right here, and once again we're going to be using our value, and in this case we're going to be passing the age as a value right here. We already provided the name, but now in this case we're going to be passing the value. So now that we successfully passed this data, we have to go into our component C, and we have to consume that data or grab that data. So I'm going to just comment this line out, And now if you want to consume that data or receive that data, so now inside this data one, what do we have to do? We have to just use our return statement. And now inside this return statement, once again, we are going to be using our data one inside this. So if I just hit enter, so it's going to auto import that right here. Okay, so now we have to use that. And once again, we are going to be using our consumer property inside there. And now inside this data one consumer, we are going to be once again using a callback function. So I'll just use like edge. And now inside there, I'm going to just use my h1 right here. First of all, we have to return there because we are using a curly braces, and I'm going to write like my name is, and then I'll just put my name inside there like name, and I'm going to also use like, and I am age years old. There we go. So if I save my file, and here you can see I'm now getting like my name is John and I'm 22 years old. So this is once again not a good way to pass our data, but at least it is better than the prop drilling. Okay, so we are passing our data, we are receiving our data, but now if you want to receive that data, we're going to have to use this callback function and all. So to solve the problem, so to solve even this problem, we are going to be using the use context hook. So now let's discuss about the use context hook. Now let's talk about the use context hook in React.js. So use context hook allows us to access the context value provided by the context object directly within the functional component. So context provides a way to pass the data through the component tree without having to pass prop down manually at every level, something which we just saw a few seconds ago. So now we only care about the use context hook, and now let's get into it. So now let's refactor this code to use our context hook. So what I'm going to do is that first of all, we have to import our use context hook right here. So once we successfully import that, the next thing that we have to do is that we have to call that right here. So I'm going to use like use context, and now inside this context, you have to keep in mind from where your data is coming from. Is that coming from the data or the data one, which we are already creating right here? Like we're creating our create context instance, and now we are passing our data by using either the data or the data one. So now in this situation, we have to tell our hook like from which context our data is coming from. So in this situation, I'm going to copy this data and I'm going to just put that right here, and I'm going to store that in some sort of a variable like username or something like that. So this is how we are going to be getting our data by using this use context. We no longer have to provide all of these callback function and return statement and all of that. So I can also use that for the data one. So I'll just use like edge, and I'm going to use my use not stat but use context once again, and I'm going to just paste my data one inside there. So now I can totally remove all of these codes. So I'll just remove there, and here you can see we can just use like our h1, and now inside this h1 I can use like my name is, and then I'm going to just paste my username right here, and I am age years old, and now I'm going to save my file. We have to write uppercase A and save my file, and here you can see I'm now getting like my name is John and I'm 22 years old. So this use context is very helpful. So this is how we are going to be passing our data, and this is how we are going to be receiving our data by using the use context. So yeah, that was it about the use context hook. Time for the context challenge. So the first thing that I want you to do is that I want you to create the user context.jsx file, and inside that file create a user context and also the user provider, which will allow you to hold the shared data. Next, you have to use the use context to access that data. So once again, you're going to have to create the user profile.jsx component, and inside that component, you're going to have to use the use context to access that data. Okay, and then finally you're going to be updating that data. So once again, you're going to have to create the update user.jsx file, and inside that file you have to define the component, then use the use context, which will allow you to access that data and somehow update that data. So give it your best shot. If you can do it, that's completely okay. Then come back and watch the solution, and now I'm going to give you my solution. So inside this src, I'm going to create a file with the name of user context.jsx, and inside there, the first thing that I want to do is that I want to import my create context and also the use state as well. Next, we have to define our context. I'm going to be using create context and execute there, and I'm going to also store there in some sort of a variable. So I'll just give it the name of like user context, and now underneath there we have to create our provider. So I'll just use like const user provider, and that's going to be equals to this children, and it's going to take the children, and also inside this component we are going to be defining our use state, and the initial value will be name. So I'll just write like John Doe, and we're going to be destructuring the user and also the set user out of this use state. Okay, so now underneath that we're going to be returning our user context, which we've already created right here. We are going to be calling there, and now inside this context we already know that we have a property called dot provider. So I'm going to just write provider, copy there, and also place it right here. And now inside there we're going to have to paste some sort of a data. So now in this situation we're going to be passing our user, and we will also pass the function which will allows us to change that user. So I'll just write like user, come on, value first of all, and here we have to define our user. And now I'm going to be creating a function which will allows us to change that state. So I'll just use like concept date user. It's going to be a function which will take like a new new name would be fine. Now I'll just write like set user, and here I'm going to provide the name, then we will just provide the updated name. Okay, so now we successfully created this function, so I'm going to copy the name of there and place it right here. And here we also have to provide their children, which we are now taking as a prop. So I'll just write their children, and that's everything that we have to do. And finally we also have to export this so that we can use them in other file. So I'll use like export the user context and also the user provider so that I can use it in other component. So now that's done. Next we have to create our component. So I'm going to go into my component folder, and I'm going to create my user profile.jsx. Okay, so inside there we are going to be using the use context to access the data from our context, and we are going to be also importing the user context, like from which context we want to get that data. Now let me create my component right here, and I'm going to just give it the name of like user profile. And now inside this component we have to access the data from our context. We are going to be using the use context to access that data. From which context? From this user context which we've already specified or defined right here. Okay, so that's done. Now I'm going to destructure only the user. We don't need this update user right here. We are only interested in this user which we are now providing right here. Okay, we want to get that user, so I'm going to remove this user profile from here, and I'm going to write like h1 user profile. And now underneath this h1 we are going to be creating our paragraph, and here we have to render our user dot name. Okay, so yeah, that's going to be fine. So now if I save my file, let me just run there, npm run dev. It's not going to give us anything because we have to define there inside our app. So I'll just write like user profile, profile, there we go. Now let me just save my file and refresh there. Still we are not getting anything. I don't know why. Let's just open my inspect element, go to the console, and we are getting some sort of error. Cannot destructure a property of user context as it is undefined. Oh, and my bad, here we also have to write our user provider so that we can provide that in our entire application. So I'll just write like user provider, and now we will be successfully able to get their data. So here you can see we're now getting the user profile, and we're now getting the data from the context inside this user profile component. So that's the second thing. Now for the final thing, we have to create our update user.jsx component, and let me just remove that from there. And here once again we are going to be importing the use context which will allows us to get that data, and also the use state, and which will allows us to create our state. And we're going to be also importing the user context from our context which we've already defined a few seconds ago. And I'm going to be using my RAFCE to define my component. And now inside there we're going to be destructuring the update user from where? From the use context. We want to destructure there from this specific user context. And now underneath there we are going to be getting the new name, and let's just write like set new name, and that's going to be equals to the use state, and the initial value will be set to empty string. Now for this UI I'm going to remove them and write my h2 which will say like update user name. And now underneath there let's just create our form, remove the action because we don't need that, and provide the on submit. And on this submit we are going to be firing this function which we are going to be creating in a few seconds. And we will also have to create our input field. The type will be set to text, the value will be set to new name which we are already defining right here. And when somebody types something in this input field, so we are going to be firing this function which will say like set name, or set new name rather, and we are going to be getting our data by using the event.target.value. Okay, and now outside from there we are going to be also providing a placeholder to there which will say like enter new name. Now let me just save my file, and now underneath there we are going to be also creating a button which will say like update, and the type will be set to submit. Okay, so now let me just create this handle submit function right here. So we are not going to be doing anything crazy, but we are going to be providing our event object, and now inside there we are going to be preventing the default behavior. Okay, and also we are going to be checking if new name dot trim. Let's just write our trim. So if that's the case, we are going to be using update user and provide our new name to there, and we're going to be also empty out our input field by providing a set new name and set there to empty string. Okay, so now let me just save my file, and now if I type something inside that component, but first of all we have to register there right here like update user. And now let me just save my, so here you can see we are now getting our data from another component. And now if I write like I don't know, my name, if I click on the update, so it's gonna update that data, but we are getting some sort of error. New update is not defined. Okay, god damn it, instead of a new name I specified the new update. So now let me just change that to a new name, save my file and refresh there. If I write my own name once again, click on the update, and here you can see it's gonna update their name. If I write like something else and click on the update, so it's gonna change there to something else. So yeah, that was our challenge about the use context, and also and also just about the context. Now let's talk about the use reducer hook. So use reducer is a hook that is similar to the use state hook, but it is designed for more complex state object or state transitions that involves multiple sub-values. So it allows you to manage state in the functional and immutable way. I know the definition sounds a bit scary, and trust me, the syntax is more scarier than the, but throughout the course, I promise I'm gonna give you a lot of practice about the use reducer hook. So now this is how the syntax will look like. First of all, we have our use reducer, and we are now passing the reducer function and also the initial value for that, and we are now destructuring the state and also the dispatch. So what is all of that even mean? So now let's talk about the use reducer initial state. So this is the starting value for the state when the component first renders. We are going to be passing some sort of an initial value to that. So if you are building some sort of a counter app, you're going to be passing a 0 value or 10 value or anything like that. Next we have a reducer function. This is a function that describes how the function should change based on some actions or some conditions. So it takes the current state and the action as an input and return a new state value to us. Okay, so this is how our use reducer will look like. But now let's talk about the things which we are going to be destructuring from the use reducer. So the first thing that we have is the state, and this is going to be the current state value which you can use inside your component. And then we have a dispatch function, and it is a function you can call to send action to the reducer function, which then updates that state. So I know it may sound a bit scary and difficult, but trust me, it's not. So you know what, now let's get into the coding, then you will get to know what I'm talking about. Let's use the use reducer in action. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to grab my use reducer from the React.js. Next we have to use that. So to use that, we are going to be using the use reducer, and it takes two parameters like the reducer function and also the initial stat. INITIAL. I can't spell the initial. So this is how we are going to be using the use reducer function. And now we are going to be destructuring two things. We are going to be destructuring the state and also the dispatch function. So now let me explain all of that right now. First of all, we are providing the initial state, which we are going to be creating right here. Like what will be the initial value of our entire state. So if you are building some sort of a counter app, so we are going to be providing the initial value of 0 to there. So I'm going to just write like const initial state, and now inside there we are going to just provide like count, and that count will be set to 0 because we are just creating a simple example of a counter. Next we have a reducer function, and we are going to be creating that reducer function right here. So I'll just write like const reducer, and this reducer will take two things. It will take the state and it will also take the action. So why do we have to provide the state and also the action? It will take the state, like what thing we are updating, and then how we have to update that thing. Okay, like what are we updating and how are we updating? So that's the only thing that you have to keep in mind. So now let's use what we will update and how we will update that. So to use that, we can either use the if and else statement, we can use the ternary, but in this situation we are going to be using the switch and cases. Okay, so I'll just use like switch, and if I just hit enter, so it's going to give the state cases for free. Now I'm going to be using action, and then I'm going to provide a type. We are going to be using this action by using this dispatch function, but you don't have to worry about what a dispatch is for now. So if this action type is equal to increment, so we are going to just provide like increment. So in this situation we only want to return every single thing which is already available inside our state, like we are creating a copy of our state, and then we only want to update the count and we want to update there by first of all accessing state.count and then +1. I'm gonna save my file, and now let me just say that once again. This reducer function will take the state and action, and if that action type is equal to increment, so in that situation we are going to be creating the copy of our entire state. Like let's suppose if we have some sort of other stuff like notification, is that on or off or something like that, so we are going to be making a copy of that. And now in this situation, if the action type is equal to increment, we are going to be only updating this count. And where is this count coming from? This count is coming from this state which we are going to be providing for our dispatch function, and this state already has the count of 0 value right here, and we only want to increment there by 1. Okay, so that's going to be for the increment. Now let's talk about the decrement. So I'm going to just remove that from here. I'm going to also provide yet another case for the decrement. And if you want to provide some more state, you are more than welcome to use that if you wanted to. But in my case, I'm going to only return first of all dot my state once again, and then we are going to be changing our count, and our count is coming from the state dot count, and we are going to be just decrementing there. Okay, so you just have to keep that in mind. So I can just totally remove these spaces, I guess. I'm going to save my file, and this is how it looks like right here. So that's cool. But now I'm going to also take care of the reset. And I guess we don't need, yeah, we do need that. I'll provide yet another case for the reset. Like we are going to be also providing some sort of a reset button to there. So in that situation, we are going to be once again returning all of our entire state, and we are going to be just changing the count to 0. Okay, so that's cool. And for the final thing, we are going to be just returning the state overall. So I'm going to just cut all of that, and here you can see this is how we are going to be creating or defining our reducer function. So now these steps are now successfully done. The next thing that we have to do is that we have to take care of the state and the dispatch. We use this state to show the data into our UI. Okay, so how that's gonna look like, here you can see I have my div, and now inside this div I'll just create my h1 right here. And in this situation I'm going to be using like state, which is coming from this use reducer. We're now using this state, and now inside this state we have the property of count. Like if you have some sort of other property like notification or is dark or something like that, we're going to be accessing there. But now in this situation we only have the count, so I'm going to access there right here. So now initial value for my count is set to 0, so we are going to be getting a 0 value right here. Okay, so I can just put some sort of a label like count right here, save my file, and now we are getting this count, and this is how it's gonna allows us to access our data inside our JSX. Now let's talk about this dispatch function. This dispatch function will allows us to change our state, like actually change our state. This will allows us to provide some sort of a rule. If that rule is equal to increment, so we are going to be incrementing. If that rule is equal to decrementing, so we are going to be decrementing, and so on and so forth. So these are just a rule. Now we are going to be using that rules inside our dispatch function, and this dispatch function will allows us to actually change our state. Okay, so I'm going to just create a few buttons right here. So I'll just use like button, and now inside this button I'm going to just provide my plus symbol right here. You can also write like plus if you wanted to, but in my case I'm going to just write like plus, and I'm going to also specify the on click event handler, and when somebody clicks on there we are going to be firing our dispatch function. And now inside this dispatch function we are going to be providing the type, and if that type is equal to increment, so you already know what we have to do in that situation. We are now providing a type, and that type is, if that type is equal to increment, like if this action type is equal to increment, we're going to be incrementing there. Okay, so I'm going to also create yet another button which will just say minus, and when somebody click on that button we are going to be just using like dispatch function once again. Let's just provide our type, and we are going to be providing the decrement right here, DECREMENT. There we go. I'm going to save this file, and finally we're going to be creating yet another button for the reset. So I'll just write a reset right here, and when somebody click on this button we're going to be firing this dispatch function once again, and we are going to be providing the type, and type will be set to reset. Okay, so I'm going to save my file, and that's all the thing that you have to do for the use reducer. Okay, so if I click on this increment button, so it's going to just increment my counter. If I click on this decrement button, so it's going to decrement my counter. And finally, if I click on the reset button, it's not going to do anything. I don't know why. Here you can see we're now providing a and without the e, reset. So now if I click on this button, it's going to make it as a 0. So if I decrement there like a lot of time, and if I click on the reset, it's working, and also the increment is totally working. So yeah, this is how we are going to be taking care of the use reducer function, or hook to be precise. Alrighty, so time for the use reducer challenge. So first of all, I want you to create the counter reducer.js file, and inside that file define the reducer function that will manage a simple counter state. Next, you have to create a file with the name of counter.jsx, and inside that file create a functional component with the name of counter. Then use the use reducer hook to manage the state of that counter. And then for the third step, modify the counter reducer.js file to add more action which will allow you to increase and decrease by a specific amount. Then update that counter.jsx file to increase and decrease the count by a specific value using the input field. So finally you have to register the inside the app.jsx file, and that's gonna be it. So once again, give it your best shot. If you can do it, that's completely okay. Then come back and watch the solution. And I'm gonna be creating my what do we call it, counter reducer.js file. Okay, so inside this file we are going to be first of all defining our initial state. So I'll use like initial state, and that's going to be equals to the count, and count will be set to 0. Now underneath there we are going to be creating a function, and I'm going to give it the name of like counter reducer. It's going to take the state and also the action, and here we are going to be using like once again the switch and cases. So for the switch we are going to be providing an action dot type. So if that is the case, we are going to be providing the first case like increment. So if the case is increment, we are going to be returning the count, and let's just write state count to access our data from our count, and we are going to be incrementing them by 1. But if that's not the case, and if the case is set to decrement, we are going to be using the return statement one more time. Let's just use your return, and we're going to be getting the count by using the state.count once again, and let's just remove 1 from there, like decrement 1 from there. So I'm not going to go ahead and create a UI for that. I'm going to also create that other state as well. So I'll just use like case and increment by amount. Come on, increment by amount. There we go. And I'm going to use like return, and let's just write count state.count plus action.payload. I'm going to write payload like so. I'm going to also duplicate there and change that to, instead of an increment, I'm going to write like decrement, D-E-C-R-E-M-E-N-T, decrement by amount. Once again, instead of writing a plus, I'm going to change that to minus. And for the default value, I'm going to only return my overall state. So that's going to be our entire function which will allows us to change our data. So that's how we are going to be creating our counter reducer. And now underneath them, we are going to be exporting the initial state and also the counter reducer function from this file. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to my component and create my counter.jsx file. And I'm going to define my RAFC inside there, go to my app and register there right here. So I'll use like counter and hit enter. So it's going to register there, and let me just see how it looks. So this is how it looks like. And yeah, we are getting somewhere. Go to my counter one more time, and the first thing that I want to do is that I want to get my use reducer and also the use state function from our React.js. We're going to be also getting a few things from our reducer file. So we're going to be getting first of all the counter reducer and also the initial state. Come on, initial state from this counter reducer. Now let me use my use reducer to define my dispatch function and also my state. So I'm going to be using like use reducer, and for the initial value I'm going to write like counter reducer and also the initial value which we've already defined. Okay, so here we're going to be destructuring the state and also the dispatch. That's going to be equals to this use reducer. Now underneath there we're going to be also creating a state for the form. Okay, so I'll use like input value and also set input value. Okay, so that's going to be equals to the use state, and here we are going to be providing only 0 right here. Okay, so now let me save there. Next, let me take care of this UI. So I'm going to go there and write h2 and provide my counter value. So I'll use like state.count to access that value. Let me just save my file and check this out. So here you can see we are now getting count, which is now set to 0. So that's cool. But now we have to increment and also decrement there. So I'm going to be using like button, and which will allows us to increment my counter, and another button which will allows us to decrement my counter. Okay, so I'm going to just write like on click event handler. When somebody click on there, we are going to be firing like handle increment and also handle decrement. Okay, and now let me create this function right here. So we're not going to be doing anything crazy, but we are going to be creating like handle increment, and that's going to be equals to this arrow function. Come on. is going to be equals to this arrow function, and we are going to be calling the dispatch function and provide the type of increment to there. Now let me just duplicate this line of code and change that to decrement, and also change the function name to handle decrement. So I'll just write like handle decrement like so. So now this function will allows us to change our data. So now if I click on this one, so it's going to increment my counter. And now if I click on the decrement button, it's going to decrement my counter. Now we also have to provide our input field, which will allows us to change the data by providing our value. So I'll just write a div, and inside this div we're going to be providing an input with a type of number, and also the value will be set to input value. Okay, and I'm going to also provide the on change handler, and here we're going to be passing our arrow function, which will take like set input value, and I'm going to write like event.target.value. That's also cool. But now underneath that, I'm going to be creating a button which will say like add, and I'm going to also create yet another button which will say subtract. Okay, and here we have to just write like on click event handler. When somebody clicks on there, we're going to be firing like handle increment by 1. Let me just write like increment by 1, or by amount would be fine. And we are going to be also providing handle decrement by amount. And now let me just create these two functions. So I'm going to copy the name of there and define there right here. Const handle increment by amount, and here we're going to be providing our dispatch, and for this dispatch, for the type, we're going to be providing increment by amount, and we also have to provide our payload. Come on, payload. And for the payload, we have to provide our input value, but first of all we have to convert that to number. So if you want to convert that to numbers, so you can use the number constructor, or you can also just use a plus, and it's going to also convert that to number. Okay, and now underneath I'm going to use like set input value and change that to 0. So it's going to clear the input after the dispatch. And now if I save my file, and it's gonna only work for the first one, it's gonna give us an error because we also have to create this function which is handle decrement by amount. So I'm gonna copy the name of that, and basically I'm gonna just duplicate this entire function and change the name of that to handle decrement by amount. And I'm gonna also change the name of this one to decrement by amount, and the rest of them will be the same. So now let me just save my file, and here you can see I can just write like, I don't know, maybe 100. If I write that and click on the add, so it's gonna add that 100 right here. And if I just write like 200 and click on a subtract, so it's gonna remove 100 from there. Now it's gonna give us minus 100. I can also increment my counter. I can also decrement my counter. So yeah, that was our complex counter, and also our challenge about the use reducer. If you're hearing a construction voices in the background, I'm sorry about that, because here in my house a construction work is going on and I don't want to delay this video no more. So now let's talk about the use ref. So what is a use ref and why should anyone care about that? Use ref hook provides a way to access and interact with the DOM element, or to persist value across render without causing a re-render. So this is going to be the most simplest hook in our hook list. So now let's get into the coding, then you will get to know what I'm talking about. Alright guys, now it's time to use the use ref inside our component. So I'll just use the use ref right here, not reducer, use ref. There we go. We're going to be importing that from the React.js, and now we have to use that. So I'll use like use ref, and for the initial value you can specify any kind of value. So I'll just write like null because I don't want to specify any value to that. And next we have to use this. So to use that, first of all we are going to be storing that in some sort of a variable. So I'll just use like const element, and we have to just equal to there to this use ref. So now I can totally log that to the console, so I can use like element right here. If I save my file and go to my console, let me just refresh there. So what are we getting? We are now getting this object with the property of current, and which is initially set to null. So this current property will allows us to manipulate our DOM or to do anything with our DOM. So I'll just change that to like input element, because we're going to be creating our input element right here. So I'm going to change that to input element. You can like change that to basically anything that you want. So in my case, input element would be fine. I'll just create my input element right here, and the type will be set to text, and I'm going to be using the ref property, and this ref property will allows us to use this ref inside our specific element. So I'll just use like my input element right here, and now if I save my file, and let me just log that to the console once again. So I'll just use like input element, and now if I save my file and refresh them, okay, so here you can see we are now getting our input, and we are also getting our current property. And if I expand this, so that current property is now pointing to this input element right here, as you can see there. So If I expand this, we have like the value property. We have a lot of things that we can do with this HTML element. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just remove that from here, and I'm going to create a button right here which will just say like focus and right Hussein. Maybe you can basically manipulate your DOM however you want, but in my case I'm going to just focus and write Hussein inside that input field. Okay, so I'll just use my arrow function, and inside this arrow function I'm going to be creating a function which will be a focus input, and I'm going to execute this. So now let me just create this function right here. I'll write like const focus input, and now inside there we are going to be using our input element dot current property, and then we are going to be using this focus method which is coming from the DOM. Okay, so we have to just use focus. We have to just use this focus method, and as soon as I save my file and refresh there, and now if I click on this button, it's gonna focus my input element right here. Now I can basically do anything I want to do with this element. I can change the color, I can like provide something inside there. So now let me show you like how we are going to be writing something inside this. So I'm gonna access my input element, then I'm gonna write my current property which is already coming from the useRef, and I'm gonna get the value, and that value will be set to like my own name. So I'm gonna save my file, and now let me just refresh there. And now once I click on this focus and write, so it's gonna first of all focus our input element, and it's gonna also write this name right here. So if I change that to like something else, like I don't know, John Smith or something like that, save my file, and now if I click on this, so it's going to write this John Smith right here. So this is how we are going to be using the useRef, and we are going to be very rarely using this useRef, but I don't know. That was a useRef. Time for the useRef hook. So I want you to create a component with the name of focus input.jsx, and that component will focus on the input field when the button is clicked. In the second part, I want you to create a timer.jsx component and just implement a simple timer where the timer interval is stored using the ref. So give it your best shot. If you can do it, that's completely okay. Then come back and watch the solution. And now I'm going to give you my solution. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just create my focus input.jsx, and let's just create our RAFCE, save my file, and let's just go ahead and go to my app and store there right here. So we have a focus input, and I'm going to execute them. Let's just check this out. Yep, it's working. Now the first thing that I want to do is that I want to grab my useRef from the React.js, and the initial value will be set to null, and I'm going to store that in the input ref as a value. And now we have to use that inside our UI. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create my input field with the type of text, and I'm going to also provide the ref, and here the ref will be that input ref which we've already stored right here. Okay, so we are going to be copying that, and now let me just place that right here. And I'm going to also provide the placeholder which will say like click the button to focus, or yeah, I guess that's going to be fine. And now underneath that we're going to be creating a button which will say like focus input, and I'm going to also attach the on click event handler, and we are going to be creating this function in a few seconds. So now let me just create this function, const focus input. And inside this function, first of all, we are going to be checking if we have the input ref dot current value. So in that situation, we are going to be taking that input ref, and we are going to be grabbing the current property of that, and then we are going to be calling the focus method on that. So anytime we click on that button, it's gonna focus our input field. So now let me just show you that. So now if I click on that, it's gonna focus this input field right here. So that was the first portion of this challenge. I'm gonna close there, and now let me create my timer. So timer.jsx RAFCE, and now we have to also store there or register there inside our app. So I'll just write like timer and hit enter. So it's gonna grab there from my timer file. So what I'm going to do is that I'm gonna grab a few things. The first thing I will grab is the useRef. From the React.js, we would also need the useEffect and also the useStat. Okay, so now let's just use all of that hooks inside our component. So I'll just first of all create my count and also set count, and that's going to be coming from the useStat, and the initial value will be set to 0. We're going to be also creating our interval ref. So I'll just write like interval ref, and that's going to be equals to the useRef, and the initial value will be set to null. And now let's just use the inside our component, but first of all we also have to create our timer so that we can work with this. We are going to be using our useEffect because in this case we are going to be working with a side effect, and for the dependency array we are going to be setting there to empty dependency array. Now I'm going to get my interval value or interval ref, and here we are only interested in the current property. So I'm going to grab my current, CURRENT, like so, and that's going to be equals to the JavaScript built-in method which is called the set interval, and here we're going to be passing a callback function, and I'm going to also give it like 1 second would be fine for a timer, and and I'm going to write like set count, and here we have to specify our previous count, and also we have to add 1 to that to our previous count, like so, and that's going to be it. And finally I'm going to also write like the cleanup function, so I'm going to just return that cleanup function right here. So we're going to be using like clear interval, and here we have to specify our interval ref one more time, and we have to provide that current property in there. Okay, so now we are totally done with all of that value. Next we have to use the inside our component, so I'm going to remove them, and I'll write my h1 timer, and here we have to render our count and then seconds. And now underneath that we are going to be also creating a button which will just say like stop timer. Okay, so it's going to allow us to stop our timer like a pause button, and whenever we click on this, what do we want to do? We just want to fire this function which will be a clear interval, and here we have to specify our interval ref and then dot current value in there. Now let me just save my file, and here you can see we're now getting like their timer. Let me just refresh there, 1 2 and so on and so forth. We are now getting our counter or timer, not counter, which is working totally fine. And now if I wanted to stop there or pause there, I can click on the stop timer, so it's gonna pause my timer right here. Okay, so yeah, that was the second portion of our challenge, and that was about the use ref challenge. Now let's talk about the custom hooks. So custom hooks are a JavaScript functions that starts with the prefix use, for example use fetch, use form, and so on and so forth, and can call other hooks within them. They allow you to extract and reuse logic that involves state or side effect, making your components more readable and maintainable. So here you can see I have a home component, and now inside this home component I am now fetching the data from the to-dos, and then I'm sending that data to my state. Okay, so this is okay, like nothing is wrong in this component, but now we can extract all of that logic into our own hook so that we can reuse that hook again and again, and we no longer have to write all of that code again and again. So to do that, first of all, we are going to be creating a function. I will give it the name of like use fetch, and it's going to take the URL, and then we're going to be defining our state for that, and then we will use our use effect. And now inside this use effect we are going to be using our fetch, then we are going to be taking that URL from the perimeter, and we are going to be passing that to the fetch. Then we can convert that data to the JSON, and finally we can push that data to the set data. Okay, so this is how the syntax will look like. This is just a basic example, but throughout the course we are going to be seeing a lot more than that. So now to use that hook inside our component, this is how we are going to be doing that. First of all, we are going to be importing our hook, and then we are going to be passing the URL from which we want to fetch our data, and then we can just destructure the data and we can use that inside our component. So this is how the use fetch will look like, and now let me show you all of that in action. First of all, I want to show you the problem, and then I'm going to show you how we can refactor our code to use the custom hook. Okay, so I'm going to just create like, first of all, my state. I'll just write like const data and then set data, and that's going to be coming from the use state, and the initial value will be set to null. You can write like array if you wanted to, but in my case I'm going to write like null. Next we have to fetch our data, and to fetch our data we are going to be using this use effect for the side effects, and it's going to take the dependency array of totally empty array because we only want to render this content once. And then I will just use like fetch method right here, and I'm going to provide this URL. We are going to be fetching our data from this URL. Now let me just use my then, and it's going to take the response, and we are going to be converting that response to JSON. And also let's just use our then one more time to get the data, and I'm going to just use like set data, and we're going to be passing our data to there. Okay, so this is how we're going to be fetching our data, and this is how we're going to be pushing our data to our state. Now inside this div we're going to be just rendering our content, so I'll just use like if we have the data, then we are going to be iterating over through their data. So I'll just use like item or to do would be fine. I'll use my to do, or you know what, item would be fine. What the hell. And I'm going to use my curly braces, and now we have to return this paragraph, and I'll just use like item.title, and I'm going to also provide the key right here, and the key will be item.id right here. So if I save my file, as you can see right here, we are getting all of their title, which is working totally fine. But now let's suppose if you want to use this same logic in a lot of components. So first of all, we are going to have to create this state in all of that component, then we have to use this use effect in all of that component, then we have to fetch our data, change that to JSON, and finally we have to push this data to our state. And that's a lot of work. And now to extract all of that functionality to a single function, this is how we are going to be doing there. So I'll just create a file. I'm going to give it the name of like use, because we are creating a hook, so I'll just give it the name of like usefetch.jsx. Okay, and now inside this usefetch.jsx, and now inside this usefetch method, I'm going to just first of all import my use state because we already know that we are going to be using some sort of a state, and we will also import the use effect as well because we already know that we are going to be using this use effect as well. Okay, so now that we successfully imported there, the next thing that we have to do is that we have to just create our function. So I'll create like cons, and you can basically give it any name that you like, but the convention is to use the use. Okay, and then you can give it like basically any name that you like. So I'll just give it the name of like use fetch, and it's going to take the URL because as you can see right here, we are going to be providing some sort of a URL. So it's going to take that URL right here, and now let's just create our function. So the first thing that I want to do is that I want to create my data and then set data, and now we are going to be storing there inside the use state, and the initial value will be set to null. Okay, so that's the first thing. Next, we have to create exactly the same use effect like this. So I'm going to copy there, and now let me just place it right here, and instead of providing all of this URL, I'm going to cut that from here. I'm going to copy this URL as a perimeter, and we're going to be pasting that to the fetch. Finally, we just have to return our data so that we can use that in other component. So I'll use like data right here, and this is how we are going to be creating our custom hook. So finally, I'm going to have to export that so that I can use that in other component. So I'll use my use fetch, and now I'm going to save my file, and now we have to use this use fetch inside our app component right here. So I'm going to remove all of that from here. I'm going to also remove this one. I'm going to also remove that. Save my file, and here you can see this is how our component will look like. But first of all, we have to use this use fetch inside this component, and this is how we are going to be using that. First of all, we have to import the use fetch, and now we have to use the I'll use like use fetch, and it takes that perimeter of URL right here. So we have to provide that URL right here. It is now providing this data as an array, so we can totally destructure that as our array. So I'll just use like data, and this is how we are going to be destructuring our data right here. So now if you have the data, then we are going to be iterating over through all of that data, and we are going to be taking the ID, we are going to be providing the as a key, and we are going to be also taking the title, and we are going to be providing the as our JSX value. So if I save my file, and here you can see we're now getting exactly the same result right here, which is amazing. And now you can fetch your data by using this hook in all of your component. If you have some sort of other component, you can totally change this URL if you wanted to, and you can create a custom hook for the form and for the validation and for everything. Like basically for everything you can create a custom hook. Now let's talk about the use ID hook. So the use ID hook in React.js is used to generate a unique IDs for a component. So yeah, it is as simple as that. So now let's get into the coding, and then you will get to know what I'm talking about. So the first thing that I want to do is that I want to create a components folder, and inside there we have to create a unique ID.jsx. I'll use my RFC inside there and register my component inside the app like unique ID and close there. Test this out, and here you can see we have our unique ID, which is looking cool. So the first thing that we want to do is that we want to import that unique ID. So I'll use like use ID and hit enter. So it's going to import that from the React.js, and now we have to use that. So I'll use like use ID and call there, and it doesn't take any parameter, nothing. Now that we have to store that in some sort of a variable, so I'll store the insert like ID. It's going to be equals to this use ID. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to define my label first of all, like label, and now for this label we want to provide our ID. So we're going to be using that ID totally dynamically, and now I'm going to just write like email, and also I'm going to create my input field. In this input field will have the type of email. We're going to be also providing an ID, and the ID will be set to, once again, you guessed it, that ID. Okay, so now if I save my file and test this out, so now let me go ahead and go to my inspect element and go to, let me just click on this one, and here you can see it's going to give us that unique ID right here for the HTML4, and it's going to also give us that unique ID for this specific ID attribute. Okay, so that's also done. But now let's suppose if I want to create another input field, so I'll just write like first of all the label, or you know what, let me just copy this entire thing from there and place it right here and change that to some sort of a, I don't know, password or something like that. I'm gonna also change that to password, and then watch what happens. So if I save my file and refresh there, and here you can see this one have the ID of R1, but now if I select this password, it's gonna also have that ID of R1. Why is that? They are not totally unique. So now I know a lot of people will think that if you want to make them unique, so we have to just duplicate there and change that to like ID2 and then specify that ID2 there. So I'm going to copy there and place that here and also place that here. Save my file, and now if I select the password, here you can see this one have the ID of R1 and this one have the ID of R5. But now the question is, should I duplicate my code for every single input? No, of course not. This is not the better way, so I'm going to remove that from here. And instead, we can provide a prefix. So I'll just write a dash, and then I can write like whatever I want to write. I can write like email, so I'll just write an email here. I'll also provide the email here. And now for this one, we're going to be providing a password. And also for this one, we're going to be providing a password once again. Now let me just save my file. We're not getting anything. That's because we're using the ID too. So we have to change that to just ID and ID. So now if I save my file, and here you can see if I click on the password, so here you can see we're now prefixing there for the email and also for the password. So now let me go ahead and go to my app. I'll just create a paragraph which will have a lorem, and now underneath this paragraph we are going to be calling our component once again. Now let's just close this. So if I close that and save my file, and now if I click on this component, so now here you can see this component have the RF. Let me just show you there. This component have the unique ID of RF, and this